Hi there, everyone. Welcome to the More You Know Gen Alpha webinar. My name is Glenda Wynyard, and I'm the Managing Director of the Media Precinct Group. Look, there are 4.6 million people, which represent about 18% of the Australian population that are aged 0 to 14 years, and they're called Gen Alpha. They're already trendsetters. They're born in a time of rapid digital change. In the words of one marketer on Tuesday that saw the first webinar, she said, Gen Alpha is an equal mix of fascinating and terrifying after watching this presentation. I do hope you get a lot out of it. You will see polls that the team are going to be asking you throughout the presentation. There'll be questions that they will pose of you. Please engage with them. Do ask questions along the way, and the team will attempt to answer all those questions at the end of it. You'll get so much more out of the research and our Gen Alpha team if you do this. Jack Geraghty and Lauren Gibb, who lead the Resolve Content Agency that's part of our group, they are the ones that have led the team that have put these insights together. And they were going to not only give you these insights, but they're going to give you some great challenges along the way for the way that you think as marketers. So I do hope you enjoy the presentation. Please welcome Jack and Lauren.
Hello.
Hello. How are you, Lauren?
Good. How are you?
I am very well, thank you. It's almost as if we're not in the same building, but in different rooms.
I know, crazy. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I know it's a little bit later, but yeah, we're keen to get stuck into some interesting insights and we hope you find them valuable. But first, I'll pass over to Jack to do the acknowledgement of country.
Yeah. So we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather today. We pay our respects to First Nations elders, past, present, and still to come, and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters, and culture.
Thank you, Jack. So we'll be covering a pretty wide range of topics today, but we wanted to obviously make it quite snackable, like any good Gen Alpha content really should be. So we'll start off with the changing face of childhood. We'll then deconstruct what the modern family looks like. We'll then take a look at what it means to grow up, or rather glow up, in a Gen Alpha generation. And then on a particularly uplifting note, we'll discuss the impact of nihilism before closing out on what you all need to know as marketers about this generation. And as Glenda said, if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end.
Cool. So just setting the scene a little bit here, I think, we all know roughly that Gen Alpha does refer to the young'uns amongst us in this tender old age of 2024. But to make it really clear for everyone, Gen Alpha are born from the year 2010 onwards. So that means they're currently between the ages of 0 and 14. And to give a bit of context for them, at least in Australia, the most popular baby names for this generation were Oliver, Charlotte, and Olivia. And as we'll see, technology is going to be a big theme of today's presentation, and it's quite fitting that the year that Gen Alpha started being born was the year that the iPad was launched. It's the same year that Instagram was created, and app was the word of the year.
And a lot has obviously changed since boomers were playing with Rubik's Cube as their first kind of form of entertainment. Now, obviously, Gen Alphas have their own personalised computer in their pocket, so we've come a long way. And I think the core thing is that this rapid change in technology has also meant a rapid change for humans altogether. And for those familiar, the Batuta Advocate's a really great cultural yardstick for what's really going on in Australian society. And these headlines here give a pretty fair indication.
Yeah, so we've got primary school teacher forced to adapt curriculum into 1 minute dance, which is obviously, referring to the TikTokification of the world that we live in now. And then slightly more intensely, we've got, are you worried about your teenager being uncontactable for half an hour between school and home? Well, you should provide them with a smartphone capable of streaming hardcore pornography directly into their developing brains every minute they get left alone for the entire duration of their most formative years.
Now, this is obviously a little bit funny, but also quite confronting. And I think even though it's obviously clearly satirical, it really highlights some pretty grim realities of the situation we're currently facing with Gen Alpha and some of the really real problems they're actually encountering in their day-to-day lives as well.
Yeah, and so at this moment, obviously, as the big stamp on the screen indicates, we do want to put a bit of a disclaimer up front. Today, what we're going to be focusing on is the realities of life for Gen Alpha and really what the implications are for us as marketers. We're not going to be talking to the ethical concerns in a whole lot of detail, but really trying to just keep it lighthearted, informative, and pragmatic.
Yeah, we're definitely not the arbiters of right or wrong in this instance, and we're not going to tell you what's ethical and what's not. So please do not shoot the messenger is what you should be taking out from that.
Cool. So let's jump in. So Gen Alpha's been given a lot of different names. They've been called iPad kids, which is, one of the more popular ones. They've also been called screenagers as well. And, it's really no wonder considering most of this generation have been glued to their screens, watching videos like the one we see here up on the screen almost since the day they were born. This one in particular is from the channel Hey Bear on YouTube. With the original video racking up almost 200 million views.
And if you watch it for long enough, you really feel yourself become absolutely mesmerized by it. I think it's the mix of the cute little faces, the colors in that dance, and I think the original video has music as well. But it's this kind of content that Gen Alpha kids are actually growing up on from the ages of literally 0. And what it does, it's actually really targets the dopamine receptors in your brain and makes them fire all the time, which is a bit of a problem. But I think what we're going to look into now is really how did we get here and why is this kind of content really typifying what Gen Alpha are experiencing?
Yeah, and how we got here is really a big question, but ultimately we changed childhood. And that's kind of suggesting that all of us are responsible for this, through both nature and nurture. In a lot of ways, we're all responsible and played a part in this evolution. When we say nature and nurture, we're sort of talking about both technology and also parenting styles. So how we interact with the world and how we allow this to shape our kids has really changed childhood forever. And in the research, we came across this turn of phrase, which we thought was really fitting. Which said that Gen Alpha are the subjects of an accidental experiment, with screens filling the roles of pacifiers, entertainers, and educational aids.
And the mobilization of technology has obviously played a really huge part in this. I think when the internet first came along, me and Jack and millennials in particular, it didn't really do much to us. It didn't really do much harm. But I think currently with Gen Z and Gen Alpha in particular, it's really swallowing them up whole. And I think access to the internet through this kind of mobilization and these smart devices has really made it possible for today's kids to spend almost nearly every waking moment online.
And that begs another question as well. How have we allowed for this rampant fixation on this technology, being glued to screens in such a dramatic way? What the research suggests is that herd mentality really plays a big role in the way that screens have become so commonplace for kids. I think through this as well, it's easy for us to forget that as the internet sort of evolved, there was distinct periods in time where we were actually feeling quite optimistic about it. I think the common discourse around the world online now is a little bit doom and gloom and pessimistic about social media and doom scrolling and all that sort of thing. But when the internet sort of first came to foray and became more accessible for us as human beings, a lot of people sort of looked at it as a new era in human evolution, a time of profound civil liberty and empowerment.
And like the internet as well, it's the rise of those screens really represented a huge step forward in societal progress. It was initially quite fun to watch a kid answer an iPhone call or, play Fruit Ninja on their iPad. But I think over time, what was kind of fun and a bit of a novelty turned into something that was actually quite useful. You'd give your kid an iPad on a long car trip or in a restaurant. And I think off the back of that, I think a lot of people thought, okay, well, everyone's doing this. I guess there's no immediate harm. Why not do it? And I guess that's where we've ended up today.
Yeah, and I will pre-warn there will be a few different points throughout this presentation where I'll sort of be shaking my fist, sounding like a bit of a crusty old curmudgeon, wondering what's gone wrong with this new generation of kids. But one of the questions that sort of begs when, there's so much time spent on tablets with these kids and glued to their screens, makes you wonder, you don't really see kids playing outside that much anymore. And what the research is showing is that kids these days are physically over-sheltered and digitally overexposed. And outdoor play actually plays a really crucial part in a child's development. And that's not just for us humans, it's something that's really important for all mammals. So what these tech advancements have done is that they've really captivated kids indoors, depriving them of vital real world experiences, which are actually really essential for their brain development.
And this in turn really and quite dramatically impacts their social skills and then their relationships too. A lot of this comes from the fact that interaction, virtual environments in particular, just isn't actually that mentally nutritious for kids. And a lot of people might say, we're just doing old things in new ways, but it's just simply not the case with these ones.
Yeah, and in these spaces, they're not really using real faces and hands to express their emotions. With this as well, their interactions with other people don't happen in real time, which has, a really big impact on their understanding of social timing and social cues. Another thing as well is that interactions with people in these environments just don't have the same consequences. So, for instance, if Lauren and I were to have, some sort of verbal altercation, we'd have to sit in the moment and, kind of address it and try and rectify it. But in virtual environments, if you have a negative experience with someone, you can really just scroll on or block them, never to hear from them again. And what we're recognizing is that this is starting to make kids feel less inclined to invest in relationships and to actually repair problems if they have issues with each other.
And as well as this, you've obviously got, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, and of course that dopamine addiction that I was talking about before with the pineapples. And all of it really plays a huge part in this as well. So what does this all mean for brands? I think the first thing is, we live in a 2-second world, and attention in particular is more finite than it's ever been and really needs to be treated as a bit more of a precious commodity in comms. Kids are no longer sitting patiently for their favorite show. They're watching YouTube Kids and TikTok, and if they don't like it, they're simply going to scroll away is the crux of it. And I think while they're obviously glued to their screens, holding and sustaining that attention is going to be more difficult than ever, and is something that marketers are really going to have to pay attention to.
Yeah, that's right. And with this, kids are really starting to become used to those heavy and sustained releases of dopamine. And to hold their attention, the content really needs to activate those dopamine neurons and those reward pathways. And obviously, there are ways to do this tastefully, but I think with the way content is at the moment, a lot of it sort of tends to evolve into those kind of dopamine-induced, dream loops that we saw in that first video. And there is a bit of an unfortunate turn of phrase for what this content's being called, which is brain rot, which isn't ideal, but it's, something we really need to be conscious of, as it is the reality we're currently working with.
Yeah, and then I think lastly, out of all of this, it's this concentrated screen time that's really making Gen Alpha the most technologically literate generation we've ever seen. And this means kind of in turn that they're adopting new ways of communicating and entertaining themselves across these platforms super, super quickly. So as marketers, it's really important that you're keeping abreast of consumption patterns and really understanding where this audience is spending most of their time. And it's going to be incredibly vital as they kind of move into adolescence. Cool. Now, we can't obviously talk about kids without talking about their parents. And it's obviously really important that we explore the dynamics of the modern family and how this is actually impacting how you should be talking to them. So the makeup of the traditional nuclear family of mum, dad, and 2 kids has obviously changed quite drastically over the last 15 years or so. More women are obviously having children after 30. Our average birth rate is actually 1.7 and is continuing to decline. And that's already below the replacement rate. You've also got more single parent mums, or single parents rather, working mums, and then also same-sex relationships too. And the role of men in family life has also been drastically altered as well.
Yeah, and of course, with the change in this family dynamic, really comes with a big change in how the family operates overall. And it's never been important to understand how this changing family unit is going to impact how we speak to them in comms. So casting our minds back to a little bit of, marketing 101, you learn about things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Another big thing is this idea of pester power. That sort of idea of, oh, mom, can I have a Kinder Surprise when you're at the, checkout at the shops? And this is something that still exists in that relationship between children and parents, but it's actually really evolved a lot in recent years. Kids are starting to negotiate a lot, and it's almost as if they're negotiating in a way in which they're trying to land a sale, with the average parent negotiating with their child an average of 6 times a day. And with this too, what kids want and how they access this has also changed drastically. And some kids really actually just bypass this pester power altogether. And I know I have personally be interesting to see if anyone joining us has had this experience before of knowing a kid who's gotten a hold of their parents' credit card, and whether it's buying V-Bucks in Fortnite or just buying something online. A lot of them kind of just don't even need pester power. They'll just jump straight in and just buy what they want straight off the card.
Yeah, and I think with all of that and all that into consideration, rather, we're moving from what would have been kind of that benign dictatorship, top-down kind of authoritative type of family unit to something that's looking a bit more like a board of directors. And I think the key reason why this is obviously happening is working parents genuinely have less time to give to their kids, and they're also actively seeking to treat their kids in a more democratic way, which in turn has led to a really specific brand of parenting that I'm sure you've all noticed over the past few years. So I'll play this quick video and you'll know what I mean.
Oh, my eye!
Oh, did my child just throw a fork at your face?
Yes.
Denver, buddy. Come here, Denver, Colorado. Come here, buddy.
Someone get him some help.
Come here, mommy loves you. Mommy loves you. I can sense something made you really upset.
No
buddy,
shit. Threw a fork in my eye.
Okay, you're not speaking to him in his love language. Denver responds well to words of affirmation and quality time.
And I'm sure we've all probably seen that play out in the wild before. But I think this kind of turn to what the phenomenon is called gentle parenting. It kind of represents a turn away from that more dominant and authoritative way of parenting in particular. And rather than seeking to kind of control the behavior, parents are now seeking to understand the behavior of their children. So, for example, instead of saying, put your shoes on now, please, it's, why don't you want to put your shoes on? And like how you'd speak to another adult, gentle parenting really encourages that open dialogue and discussion of the issue and also the behavior at hand as well. And I think what this is really giving children is more autonomy over their decisions, and we're allowing them to actually feel more in control of their behavior and reactions in turn as well.
Yeah, and the big thing we can take out from this is, kids have always wanted to play by their own rules. But what we're recognizing now is that for the first time, parents, but also brands are starting to encourage it. And again, we're not the arbiters of right or wrong. We're not saying gentle parenting is a good thing or a bad thing. But what it really shows us is that we're witnessing a really seismic shift away from this traditional authoritative control. And we're definitely well past the days of you get what you get and you don't get upset. And building on that idea, these days it's really their world and we're just living in it. And they want the products they consume to reflect the world they want to inhabit, not the brands, not their parents, their own world. They want more choices and generally just cooler products. And this means brands need to become more innovative if they want to keep up with these changing customized expectations.
You've likely all seen the customizable Nutella jars, but Gen Alpha expecting brands will play to their every whim in a lot of senses. You've likely already noticed FMCG brands doing this a lot. Cosmix, which is on the screen now, is an example of an offshoot of McDonald's out of the US, and it's marketed as being experiential dining. So basically you can make a custom drink that only your wildest dreams could kind of think up. And it obviously doesn't stop with FMCG as well, as a lot of luxury brands coming out like Balenciaga and Coach, which offer a lot of bespoke personalization to their products. But this also goes as far as integrating their products into games like Fortnite and allowing customization in there as well.
Yeah, it's a really good point. It's another thing we really need to remember as well is that obviously while we need to tailor our approach to Gen Alpha in the real world, we also need to be conscious of the entirely new worlds they're creating for themselves. Games like Minecraft and Roblox, which we can see on the screen here, are wildly popular amongst today's youth, and they change the way that they see life, disrupting their sphere of influence and ultimately changing the way they engage with the world commercially. And as you can kind of see on screen here in this Minecraft build, everything that sort of happens in these digital environments is created from bespoke design by the user. So it's literally at the player's fingertips. Obviously, you can design the way you look, you design your house, you can design your pet, and you can also determine how you can accumulate virtual wealth to sort of heighten your perceived value against, your friends in the game. So kids are engaging in new forms of digital marketplaces in which they buy, trade, and sell virtual goods, which means they're learning the value of currency in a completely new way.
And the uptake of gaming from parents is also really huge, and we're seeing them actually join in with their kids in the gaming space more and more every year. I think really in the crux of it is video games have actually become a new bonding mechanism for families and a really good way for parents to spend quality time with their kids as well. And I think as games start to become more and more of a focal point in households and they start to become a bit more of a frequent point in conversation, this is going to be incredibly important to actually start to integrate into your marketing and your strategy. Cool. So what does this mean for brands? It's never been more important to actually consider how children are interacting and interfacing with their parents as a part of that family unit. As Jack mentioned, their negotiation tactics have never been stronger. And the thing is that parents have actually never been so willing to actually listen and take part in those negotiations. Topics of discussion and the ways they're discussed are changing. And so you really need to be tactical with how you're actually planning to become a part of that family discourse and conversation.
Yeah, and we'll talk to this point a few times throughout the presentation, but Gen Alpha are extremely literate when it comes to technology and information processing, which isn't surprising, but it allows them to form opinions and make choices independently. They're a more sophisticated consumer than generations before them, so we really need to consider how this impacts our messaging and how we speak to them in our comms.
And the crux of it is it's all about them. And if you can't get, or if they can't rather get exactly what they want from you, they'll get it elsewhere. So you really need to consider the variety of what you're selling, how it can be personalized, and how it's also going to make them feel as well.
Awesome. So now we want to talk about growing up as a Gen Alpha kid. But for them, growing up is all about glowing up. And I did warn at the start of this presentation, I'm going to sound like a bit of an angry old, granddad shaking his fist, but it does make you beg the question sometimes, what is wrong with kids these days? And that's something that's handed down from generation to generation, There's always a bit of a distinction between the old uns and the young uns and, feeling that they're doing things in a slightly different way. But really, what is it with kids these days? And what does it mean to be a kid growing up as a Gen Alpha as you move into adolescence? Well, what the science is showing is that physical maturity is onsetting earlier. And with this, psychological and again, commercial sophistication begins earlier too, which can definitely feel a little bit confronting when we compare it to what we did back in our day.
And we couldn't have done this presentation without including some examples of where we humbly started. So this was back in like 2010 and 2011. Jack and I were about, 16, 17 at the time, and Facebook had just become the big thing. And you can see conversations starting to kind of play out in the status or comment section of Facebook. And this is before, Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp, and you'd have conversations around, the latest assignment at school, or in my case, eating too many donuts on the train. And at this point in time, it was actually quite rare to have a internet-enabled phone. So it was quite a treat to be able to even post that. But I think the core thing here is comparing here, we were 16 and 17. Kids nowadays are getting access to internet-enabled phones from 12. It's really actually affecting how they move into teenagerhood in particular.
Yeah, that's it. And I think that really is the big difference. It seems obvious, but it's important to call out that kids these days have phones. And 80% of kids at the age of 12 years old, when they're entering into high school, have, internet-enabled smartphones. And this is a time in their lives where their core influence is starting to shift away from just their parents and more towards their peers. And they're really, really vulnerable at this point and impressionable to what they see on their screens. And what the research shows is that even more than their Gen Z predecessors, we're starting to see Gen Alpha imitate what they see from influential figures in their feed. Monkey see, monkey do.
And many Gen Alphas have said that what they see on their screens makes them want to grow up faster or do more adult things. And many are really changing themselves to be more like the people they see online. This is obviously especially true for young girls being exposed to anti-aging skincare content and lifestyle content from a young age. And really it's creating a societal pressure for them to use unnecessary skincare regimes in particular. And I think you've probably heard at this point about the Sephora kids. You've got tweens turning up at Sephora and Mecca asking for skincare to make them look 10 years younger when they're only 10 years old.
Yeah, this issue's become so prolific that Dove's recently run a campaign, which you may have seen, which pushes for social and behavioral change called the Face of 10. And this movement was all about counteracting content that's damaging to young women's body confidence and self-esteem. And we can see examples of the types of behavior that Dove's trying to counteract in TikToks like this one we'll play now.
Get ready for us to tell you the proper way to shop at Sephora. We've been shopping there since we were 6. Rule number 1, always say please and thank you. And number 2, always clean up after yourself. Don't be a slob. That's it. 2 simple rules, guys. Don't ruin it for the rest of us. Peace out, bro.
And of course, it's almost impossible to talk about potentially damaging content online without talking about Mr. Andrew Tate.
Andrew Tate.
Andrew Tate.
Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate.
Sometimes in life, simple things that make you happy. All you need is a $75 million yacht, 30 home, hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank. Be strong and tall and smart, or just Google man the planet, and a bike. Forget the bitch, forget her, forget all the chicks. Worry about yourself, get yourself straight. And when your own shit's straight, you've got yourself together, females are an added bonus.
Teachers union from Norway to Australia to the UK to America. Teachers unions were coming out saying that young boys aren't listening in school anymore because they keep asking the teacher what color their brigade is.
Now, I'm sure a lot of us aren't unfamiliar with Andrew Tate. He's obviously been in the news quite a lot over the last year or so. But I think the key thing here is, when you consider what young women are going through, young men are just as likely to want to be more adult as they move into adolescence. And many of them in particular are really struggling to find a positive role model to actually guide them on that journey to becoming a man. And I think this is really where we see figures like Andrew Tate come into the fold. And he's got algorithms and negativity bias really working in his favor. And many are actually falling victim to the influences of figures like him and are actually beginning to align with what he refers to as more kind of traditional family values. And I think this really shows how impressionable young boys are, especially as they move into adolescence. And there's some really kind of scary research that has come out from the Man Cave, which is an Australian organisation, that's shown that 35% of young men actually believe that Andrew Tate is relatable and 25% look up to him as a role model.
So for better or for, in a lot of cases, worse, kids are now taking on influence from hundreds of sources daily. And I think this is something we all do to an extent as we grow up. We might try on different clothes or, wear different masks or even explore different belief systems in this pursuit of finding our true self. But for Gen Alpha, growing up isn't just about finding yourself through experimentation. It's also about how you present this back to the world online.
And in a lot of ways as well, and in a bit of a sad way for Gen Alpha, identity has really become a marketing tool, representing their personal brand in the never-ending campaign of life, which is quite a scary sentence, but is pretty much true of how they're kind of working through it. And I think how they project themselves and obviously how they are perceived online is incredibly important to this generation. And it also has a really big impact on their formation of identity as they move into adolescence as well. This obviously pertains to both their literal depiction of themselves, so think social media, all the way through to actually how they're creating avatars in virtual gaming spaces. And this all obviously has huge implications for brands as well.
Yeah. So firstly, commercial brands now play second fiddle to personal brands. Gen Alpha think about their own brand first, as we were just saying, and they think about how this is projected out into the world, and then think about which brands can fit in within this. And when we think about this, this really actually is reflective of the fundamentals of influencer content. So kids aren't influenced by a direct ad saying, "Look at this, this is cool." It's more about seeing that the brand is aligned with someone they already think is cool.
Yeah, and that really plays into the second point, which Gen Alpha don't want to be told what's cool. They want to actually be given the tools to access the communities and figure out if it's actually cool for themselves. And I think we obviously see this in a bad way in those cosmetics and Andrew Tate communities. But beyond influencers alone, we also need to remember that social media has become that default place where kids obviously create, they build and maintain relationships, but they also look for inspiration, they're shopping, they're sharing, they're doing everything in this kind of environment. So we'll touch on this a little bit later, but I think the core thing here is that traditional customer journeys aren't really working the same way anymore, and we'll touch on that in a bit more detail soon.
Yeah, and again, the point really applies here too. This all means that commercial aptitude starts earlier for kids. So we're so far beyond, toy placements in Saturday Disney, which had a huge influence on me with Nerf guns and all that fun sort of stuff. But kids are engaging in, these social marketplaces from a far earlier age. And the way that brands behave in these environments really needs to adapt accordingly if they want to be successful. We know that kids are using TikTok as a search engine, but also an inspiration source too. And they need to see that there's an existing community and vibe associated with your brand that aligns with their values and their own personal brand.
Cool. So now nihilism is obviously a bit of a heavy word. In the traditional sense, it actually means the rejection of all religious and moral principles and that life is quite meaningless. So obviously the modern context and how we're going to be talking about today is slightly less dire. It still has quite a lot of relevance for a group, being Gen Alpha, who have grown up in a world that has gone through such huge and tumultuous, intense change overall. And when we take a step back, there's really been this core idea at the heart of kind of Western civilization for the past 150 years or so. And it's been quite a simple idea. Each generation should be better off than their parents.
Yeah, but really, when you think about that more deeply, about Gen Alpha in particular, it's a very different state of play. You've got young workers joining the labour market, but often doing so with thousands of dollars in student debt, and then they struggle to find the sort of permanent, well-paid job that their parents would have walked to, 3 or 4 decades ago. And many of these dream jobs in industries that they're looking towards are currently disappearing from rapid technological advancement, and obviously things like AI play a big part in that. This idea of $1 million home, it now starts to look a bit more like an apartment. And if you work in a capital city, you'll be sharing a flat with some mates or living at home well into your 20s. And this is really only poised to get worse for Gen Alpha. For Gen Z and millennials, it feels like the rug's been pulled out underneath them a little bit. They've, been sold a dream that's never going to come to fruition. But for Gen Alpha, this dream is looking like no dream at all, almost. And this obviously can have a really devastating effect on their motivation, social, cultural, and political engagement, and how they interact with the world and with life in general.
I think the core question here, and the bit of a scary question, is why would Gen Alpha actually aspire for better when they don't know if better is actually ever going to come? And I think, when you think about it, they've only ever known a world where unprecedented events are commonplace. When we were growing up, you or I might have looked to our parents for them to guide us and help us feel better about it. But Gen Alpha's parents are actually going through the exact same unprecedented events that they are. And I think the core thing is, and what we really need to consider as marketers, but also as human beings, is that it's quite a scary thought what these kids have actually gone through, what they will continue to go through. And I think it's really impacted quite heavily how Gen Alpha are being shaped into young adolescents.
And the core tenets that have really made up modern life have been irrevocably altered for Gen Alpha, in a kind of permanent way. You look at these things on screen here. Firstly, you've got families are smaller and older. The ideal of what a typical romantic relationship looks like is changing a lot too. So people are becoming less interested in marriage, and they're more interested in exploring how relationships can work for them and provide more value. The face of community is changing as well. Obviously, we've got vibrant online communities that are sort of defined by interest, allowing people to make connections all over the world, but also at the same time, they're trying to counterbalance this with more in real life experiences too.
Yeah, and when you look at global politics, how one feels they belong to their country is changing. It's actually less than half of Australians currently actually feel a great sense of belonging to Australia, which is actually a record low. And that's from the Scanlon Social Cohesion Report that comes out every year. 2 in 3 jobs that Gen Alpha will have don't actually exist yet. There's actually never been less people in organised religion, and that's nearly 40% of Australians actually don't belong to any religion at all. And while it's clear that a lot is obviously changing, change also is a given as a part of the human experience. So it's not all entirely doom and gloom. I think the need for hope obviously still reigns true quite a bit. And, it's just that what hope looks like for this generation is actually going through a bit of readjustment from previous generations before them. And brands really need to be cognizant of this.
So for Gen Alpha, this goal of living a comfortable life has really started to supersede this romanticized idea of becoming rich or becoming a millionaire. Just in the same way that, climbing the corporate ladder is starting to be replaced by aspiring towards finding fulfillment and making an impact in the world and in your life. And while these new goals or hopes aren't a drastic departure from what we had previously, they serve as reframed achievement that's both possible within our current economic and social reality. It's more dependent on an individual's personal values and achievements rather than linked to these external measures. And while people always aspire for being greater or something greater, I think that's an intrinsic sort of part of being a human. It will continue to be defined by their overarching values. So there's an expectation that things will be inherently environmentally friendly, that they'll be socially conscious, and that they'll provide tangible value in some way. And like their Gen Z counterparts, they'll likely continue to seek out experiences over material possessions. And when they're looking to purchase material possessions, the question will be more like, how does this add value to my life or provide me with some kind of joy or comfort?
And I think aspirations for luxury items likely won't change. People are still going to want those things. But I think what will change is that people are actually going to be consistently asking for more credentials in line with their personal values. So, for example, where a boomer may have wanted a Porsche to look cool, Gen Alpha will want a fancy electric Porsche that doesn't hurt the planet while also making them look cool and environmentally conscious as well. And I think while, boomers might have saved for their dream home, Gen Alphas will rent vest. And another example is while boomers may have been, loyal to a company for 30 plus years, Gen Alpha will be more entwined in the gig economy and will look to integrate into that more closely. And then I think off the back of that, there's really a greater expectation on brands to actually provide more and be more to this new wave of consumers. I think obviously it's been around for a while, but being a positive force, standing up for what's good, and also being involved in social politics to fight for a better world is also going to be increasingly important. And especially, when governments are too slow to make policy change, the private sector has the opportunity to fill that gap and reap the rewards with consumers as well. I think the more brands can actually align themselves with these changing aspirations and what Gen Alpha actually want and think they can achieve in life, the more useful and then obviously the more profitable they'll become over time. And now, before we click to the next video, we've got a good example of a brand that actually trades on values in particular. It's something you might have seen recently from LG. The campaign's called Optimism Your Feed, but we'll take a look at this now and discuss after.
Have you noticed that your algorithm has gotten a little unpredictable, dare I say, out of control?
Yeah, we noticed too. Where did all the good stuff go?
It's just harder to find. What if I said there was a way to fix your FYP? LG have created this tool called Optimism Your Feed. It's a playlist designed to retrain your algorithm as you watch it.
To serve you content you actually want to watch. Think of it as therapy for your feed. To find the playlist, tap below.
And what LG did so well in that was that they actually considered the role they could play in their consumers' lives outside of what was actually expected. You could see that they integrated themselves into culture outside of their product offering. And we know that LG sells fridges and vacuum cleaners, but they still made that advertisement still ladder up to their long-term slogan. And obviously that's life's good, as we all know. Now, I think, while this is just a current example, it's obviously not news that storytelling is one of the most powerful ways to connect with people. It's a fact that human beings always have and always will find value in stories. And I think as an industry that's obviously going through some rapid change at the moment, we can all look upon storytelling as something that we can rely upon and as a great way to help align with Gen Alpha's more values more closely.
Yeah, and I think, obviously, if you can justify it as a brand, being able to tell stories about being, socially conscious is really, really positive and is going to resonate really well with Gen Alpha. But the stories that don't always have to connect to some greater purpose for your brand either. Some recent research from Live Nation has indicated that 82% of Gen Z saying being weird is in, and 58% say that the more absurd something is, the cooler it becomes. We're about to play a video, and I think if it's any indication to go by, we obviously expect for things to get weirder for Gen Alpha. But before we do, I'd love to get a bit of a gauge from the audience to see if they've heard, any of these terms on the screen here. I know it's been interesting chatting with people in the office who have kids that are a part of Gen Alpha, using terms like skibbity or what the sigma. It's interesting to get a gauge, but we'll watch this video now and we'll start to understand this completely new language that's evolving from the kids of today.
Hi. Can I get a double chunk chocolate Blumpkin, extra Felch, and a side of Quandale chungus aioli? The Aki way? What the Sigma?
Hi.
W order, by the way.
Thanks, you too.
What's your app?
Oh, Livy Dunn.
Livy Dunn. Baby Grunk.
It's nice to meet you.
What are you doing in a map like this?
Stop, you're so chalant.
I'm sorry to be so chalant. It's just, you've got a level 10 yeah, no glaze.
And if that's anything to go by, as Jack said, Gen Alpha are going to get weirder and weirder. And I think, no matter which way you do it, connecting with Gen Alpha in a way that's really reflecting their changing circumstances and also their changing tastes is obviously always going to put you in a winning position. So first thing for brands to take away from this is that trading on hope won't just be good business in the future. It'll actually be obviously good for the world and society. And I think when trust in government institutions is really low, people always look to brands to save the day and stand for something. So if you can authentically provide meaning, provide solace, or even just comfort to people in these kind of volatile times, it's going to be increasingly important that you actually communicate that to your community and to these consumers.
And as well as this, constantly readjusting how you position aspiration is a must, and it requires an ear to the ground approach, ensuring your brand is abreast of the ever-changing tide of trend. Tools like social listening and sentiment analysis can help you to get a regular temperature check, while keeping up with trends and relevant news will help you get a better idea of where your brand sits amongst it all. And if how you sell aspiration doesn't align with your consumers, your marketing just isn't going to resonate with this audience at all.
And obviously as well, you know, when we spoke about storytelling, it is always going to be king. You just have to make sure that when you're talking to Gen Alpha and telling them a story, you just need to be authentic and it needs to ladder up to your pure kind of brand essence or vision. I think telling a movie story or, you know, poking fun at yourselves, it doesn't really matter how you do it. It just matters that it is authentic and relevant to you and their brand.
Cool. So I assure you we are approaching the end of the presentation. We'll definitely have time for questions and discussion at the end. And I think obviously it's been quite a bit to take in, especially with that video that was spoken in a completely different language. Dare I say, what the Sigma? But what we want to do is, as we approach the end, is just hit on a few final points that we really want to ensure wakes everyone up to the reality of the times that we're living in.
That's it. And here are the cold, hard facts about Gen Alpha. They'll be the biggest generation in history. They'll have the biggest spending power in history. And scarily, the eldest Gen Alphas will turn 18 in only 4 years. They're obviously already spending money. A lot of it is their parents' money, but they are spending money. And as we know, they're going to be extremely discerning, extremely vocal, and very savvy consumers overall.
And I think if this presentation has shown us anything, it's that this generation really is so different to any other generation that's preceded them. And when we think about this, it'd be kind of foolish of us to assume that their path to purchase is exactly the same as well. I think, you know, obviously, as we learned in Marketing 101, we have this romanticized idea of consumers moving down a funnel from awareness through to consideration and conversion in quite a linear fashion. But what we're recognizing with Gen Alpha is that as opposed to a linear journey, the path to purchase is now looking a bit more like an infinite loop, as we have with that nice little graphic on screen there, which moves from inspiration through to exploration, community, and loyalty.
And this is obviously all based on their primary marketplace being social media. You know, it's also their entertainment hub, it's their social hub, it's their learning platform, it's where they find news. It really is a lot of things to them. And I think their inspiration is really being sourced more and more through these screens and through these platforms than it is in the real world around them. And that's really making digital influence more powerful than ever before.
And as they're so often glued to their devices, Gen Alpha are almost in a constant state of exploration. So we need to tailor our approach to the digital world and also the virtual worlds that they're designing for themselves.
Brands also have to really foster community around their products if they want to survive. That's going to be really key. They want to see how others engage with your brand before they jump in 2 feet first.
Yeah, and they're going to embrace the community around your brand. It needs to reflect their values, as we said. This is really the only way that repeat purchase and loyalty is going to be achieved. But what does all of this look like in practice?
And a great example of a brand doing it right is Bioma, who are a youth-targeted skincare brand who connect with their audience super effectively across both medium and message, and really are a great example of that inspiration loop with exploration, community, and loyalty all coming together. So I'll pass on to Jack to take you through it.
And as we mentioned with Dove and obviously the Face of 10 campaign, Bioma really recognized that people's skin barriers were being barraged by too many products that were really driven just by online trends. So they built a brand and almost a bit of a cult following by developing skincare that's designed to treat, not to be trendy. They were really inspirational from the outset. So they worked with top TikTok influencers to tackle what they dubbed as miskinformation. And they reminded their audience that skincare should be designed for our skin, not for the algorithm.
There's a lot of misinformation out there, or as we like to call it, mis-skinformation. Tell me, what is some of the most common misinformation that you're seeing right now online, and how do we tackle this?
And then from there, when their audience explored to learn more, they really owned the For You page, cottoning onto trends such as the 4-step skincare routine.
You only need these 4 steps for a radiant, healthy skin. Start off with the milky cleanser. This one is super gentle with oat and panthenol.
Then they built digital community by encouraging users to share their Bioma shelfies to win prizes. And they also connected fans IRL or in real life for those playing at home with experiential activations that featured influencer meet and greets, free samples and skin consultations, as we can see here.
The way you move, the way you feel. One kiss is all it takes. Falling in love with me. Possibility.
And as we said, to achieve repeat purchase and loyalty, the brand needs to reflect the audience's values. And Bioma really made it about so much more than just poppy products from the get-go. As I said, these ideas of misinformation or Skin Barrier Awareness Month are concepts that were designed by the brand. And they really appeal to Gen Alpha's appetite for commercial transparency. These brand platforms continually unify their community and give them something to believe in together as they restock their Bioma shelf time and time again.
My first question, why is Skin Barrier Awareness Month so important?
Because our skin barrier is so important to the function of our skin health, and I think that us understanding our skin barrier more is going to absolutely revolutionize skincare and how we treat our skin.
Cool. So we'll have plenty of time to answer questions and have a bit of a discussion in a second, but we actually have a few questions we want to put to you before we do that. And the first one is, does your current creative and media strategy reflect the changing attention economy? So is your approach to comms going to complement the media behavior of this next generation?
Secondly, does your product fit with the wants, needs, and expectations of Gen Alpha? We have to remember that it's their world and we are just living in it.
Thirdly, does your understanding of the path to purchase still stand up? The consumer funnel is evolving and we now work with an infinite loop of inspiration, exploration, community, and loyalty.
And lastly, has your approach to marketing to kids evolved enough? The kids of today are obviously drastically different to that of yesteryear, and how we really identify, categorize, and communicate with them really requires more nuance than ever before.
There you go. So that's it from us. And, we really hope we gave you at least some food for thought there, or maybe a few interesting new words to use at your next family barbecue.
That's it. And I think, if you're reflecting on some of those last questions and thinking, man, I actually really don't know the answers to some of those, obviously feel free to come to us and reach out. We've done a lot of research into this generation and are very much happy to work collaboratively with you to find that thing that's really going to unlock growth amongst your Gen Alpha audience. Cool. So that's all from us. Now we know we've got some questions in the chat. So thank you for that. So I think the first one is from Belle. So maybe Jack, I'll leave this one to you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, we sort of said in terms of technology and the way that people interact with each other in these virtual spaces isn't quite doing old things in new ways. But I think looking at the way that video game advertising has evolved, it's becoming obviously a lot more widespread, and the different formats that you can explore are becoming, so much more many and kind of varied. What I'm finding quite interesting in this space is that it almost is starting to emulate the real world, but in a digital environment, in that, you can kind of still almost buy out of home billboards, but within a game. I think GTA is a really good example, which is, a really anticipated game coming out, I think, this year or the start of next year.
Yeah.
And, I think obviously in that you can buy billboards in the world that they play, and, you're driving past and you see the billboard of the brand actually in the game. They're obviously, when you jump into a car, they have the classic radio playing. You can skip through the different stations and you can engage with, the audio ads in that way too. So I think in some ways it's obviously, increasing dramatically, but kind of starting to emulate traditional formats, but in a digital space. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah,
Lauren?
I think that's really interesting, and it's giving like Ready Player One 100%, which is scary. But I think as well, when we were talking about it before, like fashion brands are integrating into video games in such an interesting way. You've got Gucci, for example, that have all their merch in there, so you can actually, if you can't afford the real thing in your actual life, you can buy it in a game for a certain amount of money. You've also got, concerts and music launches, and there's so many things that are actually going on, and actual events that are happening in game, which is so interesting. It's such a diverse and adds so many different ways that you can kind of engage with your audience in a totally new world. which is
For
just
sure.
crazy. Cool. And then I know we have another question from Bella. So do you think how brands approach influencer marketing will need to change? I think, influencer marketing from when it kind of begun has always been a bit of a wild, wild west kind of scenario. I think though, as we kind of evolve and as, Gen Alpha in particular's huge kind of receptiveness to influencers in particular. I think the one thing that's really going to change is that, where an influencer could have just had like a testimonial video where they go, hey guys, today I'm going to use XYZ product. This is why I love it. I think that's going to change a little bit. And why I think that is I think the whole conversation around being super authentic is really going to start to lean into that influencer marketing space a lot. I don't think those testimonials are really going to fly. I think this generation are really going to expect that if an influencer works with a brand, they are really working with them in an authentic way, whether they use their product on a day-to-day basis or they have a really long-standing relationship with the brand. I think brands are going to have to be even more savvy with who they connect with and who they integrate with, not just from a reach play, but from okay, I see this influencer and I understand and I trust that they work with this brand in a serious way. And I think that's probably the core way that it's really going to change, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just to build on that too, like as we said, with that evolving consumer journey or kind of consumer funnel, with that exploration phase, people starting to look for the community that surrounds your brand and finding ways to find out for themselves how the brand connects with people in these kind of digital communities, that authenticity plays such a big part in it. And actually seeing that legitimately someone is connected, whether they're a micro influencer, I think is really, really important. So yeah, maybe that cheesy testimonial with the hand behind the product like this might have seen its days. I don't know, who knows, but
yeah. Cool. I think we have another question from Amisha. Love to know your thoughts on how I can anticipate the preferences and behaviors of Gen Alpha evolving as they grow older. Yeah, this is quite interesting. And I think the last section of what we discussed just then around nihilism, I think to start to predict preferences and behaviors, you really need to think about how they're growing up and how those kind of core values are being built at a young age. And I know a lot of that kind of stuff is built within childhood. So I think the more you kind of pay attention to the world they're growing up in, and I know in particular, you got to think about COVID and stuff like that. Gen Alpha kind of grew up in the crux of COVID and right in the middle of it. And we still don't know the implications of that. And I think from a behavioral perspective too, just thinking about the world they've grown up in with the technology and access to technology is another huge thing. And I think with this generation in particular, obviously Gen Z are starting to, become young adults now. I think Gen Alpha will be quite different to them. And I think as marketers thought Gen Z were quite different. So I think it will be really important, especially for marketers, to keep their finger on the pulse of this generation in particular. Because as we said as well, they're also the largest generation as well.
Yeah, totally agree. I think, as you said, Lauren, it's all about demonstrating how you can align with their values. And I think, as we've seen from Gen Z, they can kind of sniff out BS, pardon my French, quicker than any other generation preceding them. Those ideas of, corporate virtue signaling and brands, talking the talk, but not walking the walk. So I think that's something that brands have to be really conscious of too, is that if they are, going to outwardly suggest that they're aligning with, socially progressive values, they need to be able to demonstrate that they're actually doing that in some tangible way as well for people to be convinced.
And I think as well, when you think about their consumption patterns too, obviously from a media and creative perspective, it's really important to focus in on that and how that's going to change. And I think another core thing here too is the role of content in their lives and the role of entertainment is going to be increasingly kind of changed, aligned with their, their kind of access to technology. And I think a lot of the time as well, they've become kind of, similar to your BS kind of radar. They're seeing, content that is, commercial free as being, really appealing. And I think there's a really key role for that too, whether it's long form or short form, integrating your brand into forms of entertainment rather than going straight for ads is going to be really important. And especially as well, another key thing to think about is with this technology too, ad blockers and, that kind of technology is also going to increase. So, making sure that you're investing in the right kind of content and content that's actually going to resonate with them is going to be really important too. So there's a lot a lot changing with this generation, and yeah, a lot to be cognizant of. Cool. I think that's all for questions. If there's anything else, feel free to pop it in the chat, or if you want as well, you can contact us at resolve or contact@resolvecontent.com.au, or you can find us at our website as well, which is resolvecontent.com.au without the contact at the front. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us again, and we hope you enjoyed it or found something interesting or an insightful fact from it. But yeah, thank you again for joining us, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks so much, everyone.